Hello and thank you for watching my video. This video is going to be part of a series that I'm going to be labeling Fun with Dashcams because that will be the primary focus of these videos, but it will also be covering basic fundamentals and product reviews and just interesting things based on my new hobby, which is in particular dashcams, because I bought quite a few. I've seen some interesting things, recorded several things, and we'll be talking a little bit more about those in future videos. This particular video, as an intro, is just going to be covering the basic technical information that you will find or that you will want to know while you're researching dashcams, either for fun or profit or just for your own digs, whatever. And some practical considerations when you purchase one, where you're going to place it, where you want to place it, and really some more important details which are vary from state to state, locale to locale. Municipalities that may have certain rules about what kind of recording can be done where, if at all. And I will be covering that in the last part. So, first and foremost, this presentation is going to cover 5 basic parts. We're going to be discussing basic dashcam hardware, which every dashcam you will find should have. If it doesn't, you would need to ask yourself, does it really qualify as a dashcam, or really any kind of a camcorder? Because, you know, that's what it means, camera, recorder, so camcorder. Dashcam is nothing more than dashboard camera. So it's a dashboard camera recorder, sometimes referred to as a DVR, and I'll kind of go over a little bit the differences between some of the types you'll see, what kind of language you'll see, and really what it means. After additional features, we will be discussing camera fundamentals. Additional features will be anything outside of what you would normally expect in a dashcam, and we will cover a certain caveat with that. After the camera fundamentals, I'll just briefly cover some real-world examples of who uses them and why other people may decide to use them. And then, like I said, the last part, certain legal and ethical considerations vary by your country or state that you live in. So when you say a dash cam, it's got basic pieces. The primary pieces, of course, the camera itself, the lens, the sensors, and the video image processors or some type of recording media. A dash camera doesn't necessarily have to be electronic. If you wanted to, you could have an old 8mm camcorder using tape, which uses an analog reader, or you could, if you really want to, put an old movie camera. I mean, dash cams have actually been around since as long as movie cameras have been around. Since the old silent movies. You can look on YouTube archival footage that people have taken of San Francisco and New York from back in the 19-teens, in the 1920s. It's kind of funny. So the idea of it's basically taking a camera, mounting it onto the front or dashboard of a car, and having it record the entire scene, the view in front of the vehicle as it moves. Nowadays, most dash cams that you're going to find, for example, you know, one of these. This is a pretty cheap modern camera. This is referred to as an X3000. It's going to usually have an electronic sensor, a CCD, and some type of a chipset, an image processor. Most image processors nowadays are these that you'll see, the Ambarella, which is used in the GoPros, some other cameras, and the Sonys. All-Winner SG, this one in particular uses SG. There are many varieties of this. Like I said, this is known as the X3000, but the essential guts are in many other cameras of many different form factors, just varying by the lens. Novatech, Texas Instruments, which is using the black view, and there are a few others, but these cover most of the ones you're going to see. Ambarella, All-Winner, SG, Novatech, and the TI, which is using the black view. So after we have our sensor, we've captured the image, and we've converted it, we're going to then store it, and this is really what makes the camera useful. You know, it's not just important that we have a camera that's converting a optical light image into some type of electronic signal or some other type of media. We need to have the ability to store it. And most dash cams, for example, you know, I'm just using this as a nice cheap one, will use an SD card. It's a micro SD. Others will use standard SD, but that's not all inclusive. There will be types of systems that will use solid state drives or hard drives, older type that you'll see in like older police cruisers or courier vans, or really any type of security system, maybe an old tape, whether it's DV or VHS, or whatever. So the important thing is we have some type of storage. After we've captured the image, we store it, and then what makes it especially useful after we store it is the ability to play it back. There is a difference. You know, some cameras may be video only, but usually you'll have video and audio on most, if not all, modern ones, and not only the ability to record, but the ability to then play back and review. When you see like world's craziest police chases, you know, you are playing back what has been recorded already, of course edited, but the ability to have that portable media and then can be transferred and played back is what really makes the camera useful. That's our ultimate goal here, is making through all here to finally get back to the point where we can then play back a video and maybe see things that we didn't see before. Now, when we're talking about dash cams in particular, for example, the 3000 here, the X3000, this is what distinguishes them from most other cameras. It's the record on power. So I have here it looks like a mini USB. It receives its power from a 12-volt adapter that I plug into the accessory port in the car, and upon receiving power, the camera will then turn on and will begin to record almost immediately. Different dash cams will record at different rates. Some of them you cannot set, the cheaper ones especially. It'll be preset, but most of them will typically have a record on power, and it's set to automatically turn on, and it's usually set to then also auto power off. You'll have either it's built in the setting. For example, the 3000, you can't really control it. It starts recording when the power hits the camera, and as soon as power goes off, it has a certain amount of power that it stores, and we'll cover that in the actual hardware example here in a minute, and it will then turn off. The next thing you'll have is display options depending upon the model, how fancy it is or how simple it is, some way in which to change the settings, some way in which to, as we said, do a playback. Some units actually have a built-in screen. You can play back right there. There are a few examples of those that do not. For those that do have a display, a built-in display, they will usually have an auto screen off feature, sometimes called the screensaver. And this basically is for driver safety, to limit the distraction, because you have this little tiny monitor that may be playing all the time. By being able to have this thing shut off, it not only meets certain legal requirements of not having a display there to distract the driver, but it's also just a safety consideration. You don't have something that is in fact distracting you. And you can usually activate the screen, turn back on. I can show you an example of that in future videos as we do other reviews. But this is a very important feature. So I guess we'll go ahead and cover the basic guts. For example, this is a camera kind of laid out as it is, and I wanted to show this is really nothing more than this. So this is an example of a taxi cam, which we'll cover in a little bit, that has two lenses, one facing the front, one facing the back. Here's the front lens, and this actually has a rear-facing lens. Got a screen, the buttons, power, storage, and I'll just go ahead and lay this out real quick. One thing it does also have is a battery, and this is what we're talking about. So our fundamentals, what we have some way to capture. This is a CCD lens with a CCD. This has a viewing angle, which we'll cover in a minute, of about 130 to 140. This is about 120. But so we've got our camera, we've got our CCD, we are capturing. It goes through a signal processor. This is, again, SQ, so one of the common chipsets. This is a cheaper camera. After we've converted that signal, it will then get stored, in this case, to a micro SD card. And then here's our power. Now, when the car is turned on, this will of course power up the camera, and it will charge. But when you turn off the camera, it will also stay recording for a certain period of time. The reason, and usually from a battery, so they may have a battery or they may have some type of capacitor. The reason for that feature is because if a car, say, got into an accident and the power immediately shut off in the vehicle, that recorded image, or series of images, that recorded video, is still being stored in memory. So if you cut power immediately, that last video you've lost. The way this works is it's recording, converting, and then it's storing into a memory card on one of these, usually in the electronic dash cameras, and then once it reaches a certain size, based on settings or just built into firmware, it then records it as a file, some type of a separate electronic file, usually in segments of 1, 3, 5, 10 minutes. It really depends. For this thing, it's pretty much hardwired to record at like 1.5 minute increments, and then just keeps recording those. So it fills up its memory, and then it dumps that video onto the card, and then it's recording the next. And this allows it to constantly record. So once it dumps it, it starts filling that memory up, the RAM up, with that new video segment, that new series of images, that new video file. But so we don't lose it, that's why we have a battery. And it may be a battery such as this, it may be a capacitor. One thing to consider is in places that have a lot of heat, Arizona, West Texas, or that are exceptionally cold, Northern Europe, or far South Africa, Antarctica, whatever, or Russia in the winter, you need to consider what effect the weather is going to have on the battery. Capacitors are not going to be near as sensitive as regular batteries, and even the grade of batteries. So we were also talking about the basic hardware of doing playback. So just, we have a built-in screen on this one, so we have the ability to play video back. And we also have a speaker of some kind. Now, one thing this camera also has a microphone built into the board. That's actually the mic, is down here, right here. And so in this particular camera, it's a very cheap but effective example of everything that a dash cam does. We got video, we got audio, it's encoded, it's recorded, we got permanent storage, we have power. So after we get past the basics of what a dash cam does, recording, storing, and doing basic playback, we have other features. So the camera I just showed you is about a $50. The X3000 goes by several names. The guts I just showed you here is actually of an R300, which is pretty much identical. And it has some of these features. Not all dash cams have these features. That's why we want to look at it. And really, it really is where you get what you pay for the most part. Typically, most dash cams will have a G sensor. That's pretty standard for them nowadays, and it's used for file locking. What's a G sensor? Just like in your cell phone, you move a phone around, you move it up, you move it down. It uses that gravimetric sensor to sense where it's positioned relative to the earth or relative to a magnet. In the case of a dash cam, it's usually 2-axis or 3-axis, and when you get a sudden impact, that's going to cause a significant reading on the G sensor in at least one of the axes, and that feature is oftentimes used for file locking. Many dash cams have the ability to set based upon the sensitivity of the G sensor to either just tell it to ignore it, it'll record, but it just ignores the input. But based upon a certain shock, usually from an impact, being struck from the side, struck from the back, struck from the front, it'll automatically lock that file. Why is that important? Because most dash cameras also have a feature which I forgot to mention in that recording. It's called loop recording. It constantly records each file once it reaches the memory, the maxed out memory. So let's say you have 4 gigs and it records 4 gigs worth of file. It automatically goes to the very first file and knocks that out. So it goes to the, it goes from most recent to least recent. So it goes to basically the first file that was recorded, knocks it out, and replaces that with the new file, and it keeps doing that. That way it keeps the last 30 minutes, 1 hour, 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever the time that you have to be able to store on that medium, it will always keep the most recent videographic record. So, and this particular feature is to allow it to automatically lock that file, and to be able to call it back so you don't accidentally delete it because something happened and you were in the shock of the moment, or the car stayed running, the power in the car stayed running, and the camera just rolled right over it. Some people find this feature a little bit of an annoyance, and they'll just make an effort to turn the camera off or pull a video card out. So it's a feature that exists. It would have to be up to your preference whether you use it or not. Motion detection is an important one. It's sometimes used in what's called parking mode. Motion detection is basically just that. A lot of security cameras that sit there and watch a static frame will then see a change here or a change here, and it will begin recording. And that's what motion detection would be used for. Instead of the camera just always recording all the time, it's only going to start recording when it senses a change in the field of view. Now, this can also mean if the wind is blowing or a shadow moves across, we'll activate it. Motion detection used while the car is in motion is kind of superfluous, but it pretty much accomplishes the same thing. It just means that if you drive and you park somewhere, it's going to stop recording. You can keep the camera always running, and motion detect will sense when there is a change in the field of view, and it will only start recording again once it detects a change. GPS logging is actually a pretty interesting feature. Not every camera has it, and not all of them that do have it do it very well. So this is the X3000. It actually has a plug for a GPS sensor, for a GPS antenna. Let's see if we can view that. Yeah, right there. So that little four-way plug that you can barely see. Yes, it does record, but it doesn't record it very well. I have other examples of the S3000A board, other form factors that seem to do a better job of it. But then you have another camera, for example, a $250 Garmin, actually has GPS built in, and it records very well. Very accurate, and samples, once or a couple times a second. So GPS logging. Overlays. What are overlays? An additional feature specific to the chipset, the Ambarellas, the Allwinner, those chipsets I know of will actually take information either from the G-sensor or from GPS, and may actually do computations on speed, and will then actually overlay it into the video file. So see, a lot of these, for example, the 3000 will actually record G-sensor data. It will record GPS data if it has the GPS antenna plugged in. This does the same thing. The difference is that this records it in a separate file stored on a special volume on the SD card. This, not only is it recording GPS data and G-sensor data, it actually will burn in the GPS data via an overlay along with an actual speed calculation into the video stream itself. So you don't need special software to play it back. So that's why I say this is very specific to the chipset and to the cameras. Not every camera does this, and different ones do it in a different way. But it's an interesting feature to have. Wireless capability, used primarily like Blackviews and a couple others that have been hitting the market since late 2013 and beginning of this year. Wireless is literally the ability to use a tablet, a cell phone, a laptop, some type of G or N device to be able to connect to the device via an ad hoc wireless network, and then to view the actual live video stream or download videos that are currently recorded on the storage media. I can't say I really have a use for this feature, but some people actually might have a very good use for this feature. But it's only going to be in more expensive cameras. Like I said, you get what you pay for the most part. Pretty standard. You start getting up into the $70 to $100 range. GPS logging that's worth a darn is typically going to be in the $100 and up, usually in the $150 and up. But there are some cameras in the $120, $130 range that'll do it. Overlays kind of goes with that. Wireless is typically going to be $250 and more. So your Blackviews and vivdeo and a few others that are very specific typically don't have an external screen, so they'll have a wireless connection you can make that you can then view a live video stream via a tablet, via a phone, or something else. Multiple lenses, kind of an interesting one. Which again, we were talking about the 3000 versus a Garmin 20. So we have, of course, the main camera, and then we have a rear lens. So this would be a multi-lens, 2-lens. We have single lens. We would normally, when we talk about a single lens, we're going to call that a dash cam. When we have a dual lens setup like this, one facing forward and one facing backwards into the cab of the vehicle, which is what this would be, because imagine it's hanging right here, so I'm recording the roadway and I'm recording the passengers in the vehicle, or at least the driver and what's in the immediate area of the driver. This is sometimes referred to as a taxi cam because that's a very popular setup for taxi drivers. For anybody who needs a view to record what's going on inside the vehicle for safety, for whatever reason. Then we may have setups that use more than 2 lenses, which are commonly called car DVRs. A lot of times you'll see they'll say a car DVR. Now that pretty much is a catch-all term. Dashcam, car DVR is one and the same thing. This is just a car digital video recorder. Dashcam, dashboard camera. Taxi cam, more specific to a setup that has multiple recordings, one facing the front and one facing the inside. Car DVR is typically a more generic term, though, you use for the multi-lens cameras. A lot of especially for 3 and more that actually record to some type of media. This is where you'll see, like a lot of your truck drivers will have, they'll have an actual vehicle in DVR. First party and third party software, very important, again specific to chipsets. The chipsets will encode the video in a certain format, typically in individual video files. Sometimes usually they store them on a FAT32, FAT16 accessible to most operating systems. This little guy is a little different. You have to actually use a special reader to read a proprietary file format on his card, or the proprietary partition on his card, to actually be able to recover. And there's an interesting thing that has to do with security. You can then set it to a password, and that's why they sometimes refer to these types of devices as a black box, because only the person that has the password ultimately can get to read that card and therefore get to review those videos. So now we're going to cover more of the camera fundamentals, and I have a few examples and a few teaching aids for this. We're going to be talking about lens viewing angle, pretty simple. Resolution is a little bit more in-depth topic, and you have to be careful with this one, and that's why we talk about native versus interpolated. Your exposure, your white balance filter, WDR is an important feature. These are all considerations when you're actually buying the camera, what you're going to use it for, what acceptable video quality ultimately are you going to have that suits your needs. The more money you spend, typically the better optics, the better CCD, the better features going to have, such as WDR. That's why I want to talk about this real quick. Along with having more resolution, we have a more sensitive CCD working with a video processor that can then kind of tease out more detail or better handle artifacts, strange lighting conditions, abrupt changes in lighting or motion artifacts, to use with features like WDR to give you a clearer picture. WDR primarily is, and that's why I want to talk about this, is a feature that's starting to become popular in some of the more 100+ cameras, and this means wide dynamic range. It just means that the CCD is more sensitive, can let in a little bit more light, and therefore the video processor has been tuned a little bit to take advantage of that and to help build a clear picture. But the more sensitive you have to dark image, to low light conditions, sometimes is a trade-off in that it flakes out a little bit when you get into sudden changes in contrast or brightness. The idea with wide dynamic range is that it actually allows the CCD to be more sensitive, and it does a better job at not only handling the changes and being able to build a clear image, but to handle those sudden changes in contrast and those sudden changes in lighting levels to give you an overall clearer picture in all lighting conditions. We talked about exposure, white balance, and filter. These are settings that you will see on most cameras. I'm not going to cover those because they call them different things, but typically EV, WB, and maybe a filter, sepia or normal, cloudy, or whatever. Typically you can leave those as auto. The camera's pretty much will adjust themselves. You're really limited by the CCD, how well it can handle light, and by the chipset, how well it can process the signal from the CCD. So most of the time just leave those as auto. Sometimes you may find it advantageous to change those. Storage considerations. How much video are you planning to record? For example, this thing, will support up to 32. This one will support up to 32 gigabytes on a micro SD, but with this running at its full HD 1920 by 1080 resolution, I'm going to get about maybe 5 to 6 hours of video. This records two video streams, squeezes them together, and makes a quote-unquote HD of 1280 by 480. Basically 640, 640, two VGAs, stick them together, and then by 480, we'll record about 11 hours. So what's the trade-off here? I get more coverage, but I get a kind of a crappier picture. It's not, lower resolution, not as clear, but it's still a video record. Here I get a single camera, but I get much higher resolution, but that's the trade-off. I'm getting much higher resolution, but I'm having to use a lot more of the storage for it. This gives me a much longer storage, so those are the kind of considerations you have. $50, $250. Storage considerations. I also want to touch briefly about mounting, placement, and what's called POV, persistence of vision, your field of view, what you see, when you're looking in a certain direction. When we're mounting the camera, that's going to determine what it sees. We also have different mounting options. Most cameras will have a suction cup. This is the one for 3000, little cradle. You'll stick it to the window. It will then lock in and be securely fastened to the window, and you place it where you need to on the front windscreen. This guy has the same thing, suction cup. But then other mounting options you have may be clips for your visor, and we'll cover all that in a second. So your placement is determined by your mounting options. And ultimately these are going to determine what your camera can see, which ultimately is the goal of all this, mounting a camera in your car, is so it can record a certain view for a certain thing. So covering the fundamentals. Most cameras are going to have a lens and a sensor. Light comes in, it's going to be refracted. A camera obscura, the pinhole camera, is the quintessential camera, been around since the Middle Ages, well, really since the Greeks. And the basic principle is we have light coming through a lens just like your eye. It's going to be refracted through the lens, focused onto some type of a sensor. I say sensor because it's a nice generic term. This could be a 35mm slide, it could be a CCD, it could be an old analog tube. Regardless, it's some type of sensor that's then going to be able to capture the image and of a particular media. In this case, now most cameras nowadays are going to be digital media. We're going to take a frame, take another frame, stitch those frames together, store it in the memory, and by building those frames together in a certain way, using certain types of software or a certain algorithm, or in the case of a DV, storing it encoded in certain segments on a tape or on a hard disk or on a micro SD card or whatever. We're ultimately going to build up a series of images that will be stitched together in some way to form a moving picture. When we talk about view angles, this is the basic rule: is view angle plus resolution is going to equal the clarity of your image. And I just did this to kind of give an example of a few of them. So, if you say your view angle is 70%, 90%, 120, 150, some of them will say, up to 140 or more. Well, what the hell does that mean? It just means, how wide of a field of view do you have? The human eye, where you focus to read, is about 70 degrees. 90 degrees is more for inner peripheral. Most of our peripheral, though, goes past 120 up to actually almost 180, 200. Some people up to 220 degrees. But the primary focus, see, the thing with the lens is, remember, is that this is where we focus. That light coming in at these different angles is ultimately going to predicate, you know, how much we see. Different cameras, their different lenses will be set to record a certain view angle, and that's what when you read the literature, it's important to know. The wider the view angle, the more it sees, but also means that the more of an image it's going to distort, especially around the edges. Your primary focus will be maybe here in the middle, but as you increase that field of view, by increasing that view angle, it's going to create more distortion, especially on the outside, and give you that fisheye effect. If you look at certain action cameras, that's a big thing when you watch a lot of those videos, like from GoPros and things like that, is the cheaper ones will have a really wide field of view, very similar to, say, a GoPro, but the GoPro has a very large resolution behind that and can actually help adjust, and will do image stabilization, and will do a little bit of contouring of that image to give you a flatter image, to get rid of that distortion and give you a really nice, wide, high-def, clear view. Cheaper cameras don't really do that. A dash camera is not too concerned with, you know, the clarity, because it's not an action camera, it's not a production camera. It's there to record you driving. It's a record to, you know, for certain uses, and that's it. So they're not usually too worried about that. So they want to, with a dash camera, capture as wide a field as is reasonable without making it so wide and that it distorts and really makes it unreadable. So that's why you want to consider your viewing angle. The wider the better, but up to a point. But remember that we also are recording it in a certain size, a certain resolution. The smaller an image with a wider angle is going to create less clarity. A narrower field of view with a much higher resolution is going to give us much greater fidelity. But at the cost that we can't see as much, we are focusing more on a narrow view versus having an intermediate 120 to 140, which is typical, that captures most of what goes on in front or behind the camera in the POV. When we talk about resolution, this is specifically what we mean. Some of your cheaper ones, for example, that X3000 I was talking about, has two VGA or standard definition resolutions, 640 by 480. So let's just use this as an example. So here's how big our image is. Whereas some cameras will refer to themselves as 720 or high def. It is 1280 by 720. You notice it's considerably larger than the VGA or the standard definition. But when we talk about 1920 by 1080, sometimes you'll just see this as 1080, 1080p resolution, much larger. And remember, this is a count of pixels per pixels, pixels vertical versus pixel horizontal. So that's something you need to remember, is that the more resolution that your CCD or your sensor can record, the finer the image, the more granular that video signal is. And therefore, it also means, since that much more data is being recorded, that much more storage needs to be used up. So higher resolutions is going to equal less time on a card ultimately, because more storage. And this brings us to a very important topic, which is when you're looking at it, you want to look at these different reviews that people may do when you're buying a camera, is because we have a native resolution of a CCD or some type of a sensor versus an interpolated or a scaled resolution. So some of them will record, and you can. This is why it's real important to try to watch 720 versus 1080 sample videos. Is you may have a sensor that records 720 well, and it may say that it also records up to, you know, 1080p, this 1920 by 1080, which is full HD. The problem is that it's not that it's a more sensitive CCD. It's a cheaper CCD. It's just taken the little image and scaling it up. Whereas if we have more of a native resolution, it's able to record that. Usually it's going to be, of course, larger than 1920 by 1080, but it'll have a very sensitive CCD that is able to record at a native resolution at, or, you know, just a little bit more than 1920 by 1080 full HD, or even larger than that, and they'll just crop down. But the obverse also goes. You may have cameras that have a CCD that's recording 1920 by 1080, but it may advertise that it can record, you know, up to like 2300 or a little bit larger. And so you got, and it again brings us back to this situation. You know, we're starting with a smaller native resolution, and we're interpolating the points that spread it out. We're smearing it out into a larger canvas, so that's going to, of course, smear the pixels out and make it a little more grainy. We're losing granularity of data because we're using a less sensitive to make a larger image. So starting off with less, and we have to fill in the gaps. So that's why we talk about interpolated or a scaled image versus a native resolution. This size sensor equals this size image. This last part I want to talk about is placement. I hope you enjoy my highly detailed example of what a typical front view of a dashboard is going to look like. Steering wheel, this is our radio, and let's say this is a placement in the middle of our dashboard. Of course, our front windscreen and visors. Most people are going to be content on putting their dash cameras somewhere near the rear view mirror. It may be to one side or the other, but typically down below, and here's why. In most of your suction mounts, you know, you're in a setup like this, I would most assuredly want to mount it, you know, somewhere in a way so that it's near my rearview mirror, but where it would probably be like to the side or, you know, directly underneath, so I can still see my mirror and be able to look and have this recording what's inside. Because remember, if you have anything blocking the lens, well, you're recording that. It's kind of useless. So this is why we want our POV to be pretty clear, pretty free, and unobstructed. And also, remember, the higher up you're going to put that camera, it's going to give you, you know, it's the horizon effect. It's going to give you a better view over the horizon. The lower it is, you know, your plane is going to be lower, and you'll have to look up a little bit, you know, to be able to see what's going on. Whereas if you have it up a little bit higher, it gives you more of a view of, you know, what's going above your plane of view versus below your plane of view. So when I say plane of view, that's an invisible line, an imaginary line measuring out from the middle of the lens off into the horizon. So then you have, you know, what's going up above versus what's going below. If you put it down here on the deck, on the dash itself, unless you angle that camera up a little bit, you're pretty well recording your dashboard and the hood of your car. Whereas if you put it up a little bit higher, somewhere near the mirror, or even maybe attached somewhere up here near the visor if that mounting option is allowed in your vehicle, or depending on what kind of thing you want to rig up, it gives you, generally this is preferred, is to mount up a little bit higher to give you a better field of view. Some considerations for that may be that in your particular municipality, your particular country, they may not allow you to attach something in certain parts of the front view screen. They may say, well, you can mount it here, but not here. You can mount it, say, here, but you can't mount it below here, up there. Or they may just say outright, you do not have, you're not supposed to have anything mounted on your front windscreen. And that's those are the kind of considerations that you need to take into account as we go into the last portion. So this is just why I wanted to cover this, is placement is important, and you need to consider that when you're, not only when you're buying a camera, but what kind of mounting options you have, because with that suction mount, it has to be able to hit a nice flat hard surface, and it's also prone to maybe fall off when it gets too cold or too hot. So you may want to use a more permanent add fixture, like a piece of 3M double-sided tape and a small surface mount that permanently adheres it. But then again, with the suction mount, you get to move it around where you want. You get to move it from vehicle to vehicle, permanently mounted, permanently mounted. I personally prefer to mount a camera directly behind the rear view mirror. Number one, it keeps it out of sight, so you're not bothered by any blinking lights or any view screen on it. It also actually provides the perfect view, because most rear view mirrors are mounted up near the top and usually centered. So if you usually mount it at or around that same position, usually gives you one of the best possible advantages of what's going on all around the front of the vehicle. So kind of the last part of the talk is, or getting to the last part of the talk is, you know, examples of who uses these cameras most. Police, of course, are probably the prime example. Anybody who's seen, you know, Crazy's Police Chases, the show Cops, or any of these shows from the 80s and the early 90s that really got people turned on to the idea of dash cams. And when they think about it almost exclusively here in the United States, we think of police. But they're not the only ones who have it. Of course, the same reasons they have it are the same reasons many other people have it, which we'll cover in a minute. Truck drivers is another very important one. We always talk about, you know, in the state of Texas, we have all these truck drivers. I remember when I lived in Oklahoma, half that state seemed to be a bunch of truck drivers, and it's because they have a lot of interstate traffic that goes through the middle part of the country. And these truck drivers are driving very long distances, driving through many cities and dealing with all kinds of people. And a lot of times they would have either get into an accident or somebody would cut them off and get hit. And a dash cam is perfect for them because it helps to prove to the police, but primarily to the insurance companies. And when I say truck driver, I don't just mean exclusively long-haul truckers. It can be local delivery, couriers, you know, hotshot drivers, pizza delivery drivers. You know, anybody who's a driver who spends his time on the road may want one. And the reason is very similar, the same reason the police want one. They want a video record of whatever interaction. In this case, it's an interaction with another vehicle resulting from an accident. And it really is going to help, you know, as long as they're doing their thing like they should do, or at least trying to do the thing like they should do given the conditions, to protect themselves against liability from crappy drivers, crazy drivers, bad drivers, people that are distracted on cell phones or whatever. And again, taxi drivers. This is for not only the reason of the truck drivers being able to look in front of the car, but also being able to look behind to be able to record within the cab of the vehicle. Why is this important? They face robberies. They face people that may try to attack them, or just a general record because they may be accused of theft or they may be accused of, you name it. People get drunk, people get silly, and people may forget where they left stuff and may say, hey, that taxi driver stole my stuff. This would give the taxi driver the option to be able to look back at his record and say, hey, did they take their stuff with them? Did they leave it? Did I find it? Maybe I can show that somebody else took it. Help them out, help them get their stuff back. Or, you know, somebody is maybe acting in a way they shouldn't, and this will allow the taxi driver to have a record to be able to show, you know, who was in the right, who was in the wrong, and, you know, kind of clear up a lot of the he said, she said by having an objective third party more or less to the interaction. When I say this, concerned parties, you know, it's pretty much, concerned parents. Let's say parents out there and either, you know, you don't trust other drivers with your kid, or you may not trust your kid. They may have shown that they don't have very good driving skills. And a dash cam is a great way to kind of get a video record and then to be able to sit down with them. You know, you're saying, I trust you. You can go out there and drive, or maybe you are in the process of teaching them yourself, or maybe you run a student driving school. A dash cam would allow you to record that drive, whether attended or not, and then you can kind of do a compare and contrast. So that's why I put this down as kind of concerned parents. You know, you of course know that young people, anybody 18 and below, especially guys like myself, I remember this, really below the age of 25 here in Texas, we're always having to worry about our insurance rates and always having to worry about accidents, because almost invariably, if you were younger, especially if you were a teenager, it's pretty much, well, you know, the kid did this or that, and it was almost accepted without question by insurance companies or whatever. Well, I've learned over the years that it's not necessarily the kid's fault, that you may have somebody who was distracted, blame it on the kid. Well, the concerned parent, for the sake of their kid, for their driving record, for their insurance rates, as well as just for their for their general education and helping to be able to review their driving habits and be able to help give them some constructive observations, you know, to help them drive better. You know, all those are good reasons why parents may want to mount one in the kid's car. I mean, hell, the kids may end up wanting one. Last part, anyone who needs one. People like me and you. I mean, if you're obviously not a cop or some kind of law enforcement, private investigator who has one of these in your duty vehicle, you're not a truck driver, long hauls on the highway, or a delivery driver, you're not a taxi driver, and you're not the parent that maybe you're the parent that already has one, you know. For everyone else, that's us. Anyways, we need anyone who wants one. We can have one. Reasons? protection, liability, and fraud prevention. It's mainly about insurance. That's the single biggest motivation. If you go back and look at Russia, you can hit YouTube and see all kinds of crazy dashcam videos. They're starting to get more popular in Europe. I've seen a few more in Germany. Not so many here in the United States. Canada has a small but growing fan base of these things. But our primary motivation, regardless of where we go, Russia's, although a perfect example, is liability. People trying to pull what they call smash and cash scams, step in front of a car and get into an accident, or the quintessential one that we know in the States, the guy who pulls out in front of you and then slams on his brakes and you hit him from behind. Most municipalities say it's almost automatic. If you get hit from behind, it's the other guy's fault. Well, with the dash cam, you can show, no, in fact, he pulled in front of me and then slammed on his brakes. You know, when you have an automatic liability clause in the law, you know, you need something on your side. So if you have an objective record that shows, no, in fact, I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. This guy actually came up in front of me and slammed on his brakes. He was distracted. He was doing what he shouldn't be doing. She was doing what she shouldn't be doing. It's going to save you. You know, I don't know about you, but I like to hedge the bets in my favor if at all possible. $120, $200 for a dash cam may make the difference between a real-world example that I'm going to give in a later video of $28,000 coming from one person's pocket versus another's. And it's a very interesting video. I have the full video and actually have some of the correspondence, which I won't share, but I will share some details of it. That's why I always like to say is, when you think of a dash cam, think of it as insurance for your car insurance. That's probably the primary motivation. I can't really think of too many other motivations other than the fact that you have a record for your driving. Real world, yeah, I was going to cover the real world example in a future video. Now, who uses them and why? We must also consider some very pragmatic considerations. So that's why I said legal and ethical. Legal because in some places, and understand that this is not legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just, you know, based on my reading, my understanding. My understanding is more for the state of Texas, but this is kind of just generic information, and, you know, of course, caveat emptor, buyer beware. You know, your mileage will vary depending on where you live. Generally, recording in public of anything that's in the public view is totally legal. You can think of it as an extension of castle doctrine. In most places, almost unilaterally, your house is your castle, and you're supposed to generally be free. And when I say castle doctrine, it's a common law concept, very important in the United States, in the development of our law system, that your house is your castle. You have a right to private property because it's your castle, and therefore you have a general right to be free of other people breaking in and stealing your stuff, or people uninvited coming in, or people coming in and threatening you in your house. So hence, you know, you should be secure in your person, in your dwellings, the castle doctrine. In a vehicle, after cars got introduced to the highways of the United States back at the turn of the last century, the idea of the castle doctrine kind of extended. It's not considered an immediate extension of your house, but it is to a point an extension of your castle, of your domain. It's your private space. That's why you have no smoking rules in a lot of areas, but they say, but it's okay for you to sit in the parking lot and smoke in your car, because you should be totally secure to be able to smoke in your house if you want. And by extension, your car is kind of considered an extension of your domicile, of your personal space, of your castle. So that's why we lead into this idea of recording. You know, if you set up a home NVR, DVR to record for security reasons in your house, you know, it kind of goes that, you know, you can also set up a certain camera system to record for security of your stuff or your person in your vehicle as well, as long as, and this is the important one, as long as it is, you know, certain areas may require that it's conspicuous, but mainly that it's of the in the public view. So as long as you're in a public roadway, a public parking lot, a publicly accessible space, they call this, public view, public access, where there is no real expectation of privacy. Where no reasonable person would say, if two people are standing there, you cannot reasonably assume that they have any kind of privacy because they're within earshot of anyone else in the general public, or at least within a fair distance that you would say. So generally in the public view. So most of the time taking pictures, taking videos in a public space, in the public view. For the United States, Supreme Court has ruled for the last 30 years that is totally okay to take pictures, to take video. Recording audio, though, gets a little bit more interesting, because remember that audio communications predates video communications. True videographic systems started back in the 1920s with mechanical TV cameras and mechanical TV sets, and progressed from there into the 30s. But remember that it was Alexander Graham Bell who invented the telephone back in, even before that, the telegraph. And it was Edison and people before him that started with audio recording technologies, with the phonograph and the phonographic cylinder, back in the century before, almost a century before videographic systems. So the law has had a lot more time to consider audio, and because audio is considered much more pertinent to personal communications. Because remember, we don't really care so much that I can see that you're standing near somebody. It's the conversation you're having with that person is what makes it private. Just that I know that you're standing next to your mom, okay, that's you standing next to your mom. But if your mom is trying to have a private conversation with you, to tell you something very important that she needs to tell you about your dad or your sister or something like that, well, you know what? I may not be privy to that information, and that's why we have laws that are referred to as wiretapping, privacy laws, that may designate certain restrictions on audio. And of course we go back to here. If it's within the public earshot, within public view, generally, it's not a big deal. Some states, however, have laws that are in a very questionable state. Really, some of them are just outright unconstitutional and illegal, but they're still being enforced in a certain way that is under contention. So in certain areas, you might want to consider turning that audio off. Many cameras have the ability to record audio and video. Video is primarily what you want. Audio is a bonus, depending upon, certain things. But, you may want to consider, certain places like Massachusetts, New York. There may be more restrictions. You might have to consider turning the audio off, and you can. And there's also an understanding of, in order to record personal consent laws. In the state of Texas, we have what's called one-party consent. As long as one person who's party to that conversation has given approval, I am the one recording, I can take that recording, and for personal use, I'm not going to blast it out on everything, but purely for my own personal use, there's usually no problem with that. We start getting into problems when we start getting a broadcast, or we start, talking about what we're going to use that video for. But there are certain restraints on this. But generally, if we're recording and we're using it in a non-commercial format, typically you're okay, especially if it's in a public view. But in your car, again, it's kind of a more private space. The view is public, but the conversation in the car may not be. So when people are riding with you, you might want to make sure, you might want to check the laws in your area, in your country, in your state, and just make sure that you understand that, or that they understand. You may have to tell them, or people that may be talking to you, for example, police officers. In some states, they will actually come out and say, I'm just letting you know that you're being recorded. And you would really, and that's because it's to meet a legal threshold, because they have consent laws. By the fact that they're telling you that, they've already met that condition. You would then want to come around and do the same. Okay, well, it's good, that's good to know, and I understand. I'm also keeping a record. Or you may not have to worry about that. For example, state of Texas, I can leave audio and video running. As ethically, as a nicety, I let people know that I have, audio and video recording in the car. And pretty much, if you want to ride with me, it's recording. So be careful what you say if you don't want a permanent record of it. They may not care. You may want to consider rigging up a setup so that you can turn off. You may either turn off audio or may want to turn off the camera if someone wants to have a conversation and doesn't necessarily want that kind of content being recorded. you know, like I said, your ethics guide a lot of this. Remember that the camera has a bias, but I mean the camera has no bias. We're biased in what we see and biased in what we hear. You know, we take sides in certain things. We're human beings, we're reasonable, we're rational, and we form opinions based on that reason that we have. But the camera has no concern. It has no bias. A record is a record. And this is important. This is a very important consideration when you get a dash cam, because if you're going to keep it running, the point is to have a record. The more you record, the more evidence you have of what's going on around you. And it may also be evidence for your bad driving. So before I would mount one of these, I would have to ask myself, am I a good driver? Am I a courteous driver? Am I prone to what may be referred to as road rage? Do I have a habit of running my mouth at people? And the reason is because of the last point. You're recording, especially if you're recording with video and audio, you are recording everything that camera is privy to. And it may be, and it is a record, and it may be a record that you have to submit over to somebody. And that record with an insurance company is going to be handled differently than with a court. You know, insurance companies will buy in and are oftentimes a lot more amenable to people with personal dash cam video. Some places actually, in certain countries, are actually starting to institute savings plans. I think the UK is one, and Germany might be one. In the United States, not so much. It's not considered a safety feature, but it definitely is a nice thing to have that you can provide your insurance company. As an objective record, you know, to show your side of what happened. Here's my statement, but hey, here is also a video that shows, you know, and it may not show everything, but it may show enough. It may show the fact that there was an impact. It may show the fact from the G-sensor record that you got hit from behind. And you can see in the camera that you weren't moving. So, you know, you definitely got hit. You didn't run back into somebody, someone ran into you, or vice versa. But when you start talking about court, you know, using it in a legal context, remember, a record is a record, and anything recorded, video or audio, is subject to rules of evidence in court. So you may walk in with this recording to show something. Well, just as it can be used for you, it can be used against you, and the camera doesn't give a shit. It does not care. So if you find that you're a bad driver, you're an aggressive driver, you really need to rethink whether you want one of these. If you find that you want to keep yourself accountable, if you decide that, you know, you feel you are a bad driver, what this does is the camera, since it doesn't care about what you think, it actually is giving you a very nice record, which is a reason I didn't discuss. But some people actually have used this for that reason, just like they said for the students, the student driver or the concerned parent. Recording yourself may actually make you a better driver. And the fact that you have what's called the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is the understanding that people being watched behave differently. You having that camera in your vehicle may actually be an important psychological factor to help you break some bad driving habits. So keeping that camera in there, you keep yourself mindful of it. You let yourself know, I'm being recorded, so I need to make sure I don't speed, that I don't do certain things. You know, Hawthorne effect, or they call it observer effect. Observer bias is not the same thing. But this main consideration, though, is, you know, when you're talking about court, you know, insurance companies handle this kind of information differently. They'll be a little bit more discreet about it. If you want to bring this thing in court, both parties to an argument, the plaintiff and the defendant, both have equal access to evidence in court. And any evidence you provide in court can be used for one way or the other. You know, so you want to make sure that if you have a record, you know, if you have a camera in the car and you know that you were driving very poorly, you might want to be very careful before you start mentioning to anybody that you have this thing, you know. Or you might want to consider, you know, if you have a tendency to curse a lot of drivers off, you might want to turn that audio off. You know, do you really need it? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. So with that pretty much covers a lot of information. I hope you find this useful, and I will conclude my video wishing you well, and please stop by and check out my new videos. Again, this is going to be a part of a series called Fun with Dashcams.